From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Anne-Marie Horder. Chicago landing the convention. Democrats picked the city for their 2024 flagship gathering. We'll dive into the politics that led them there and what it means moving forward for the party.
Investigations into President Trump. Former aide Stephen Miller testifying today before a grand jury in Washington. And as that unfolds, we'll speak with one of the few challengers to the former president, the former governor of Arkansas, Asa Hutchinson, on his campaign for the Republican nomination.
And the Biden administration is set to release the toughest emissions rules ever tomorrow. Climate advisor Ali Zaidi says the U.S. can play to win the EV race.
The core goal has to be boosting our energy security, making this stuff here in America, and reducing our emissions.
Interesting conversation with, I think he's dubbed the climate czar. What's interesting, Joe, is Biden has landed in Belfast.
Yes.
Congress is technically out of recess, but there's no shortage of news. And now I feel like you really have this push-pull between D.C. and Manhattan.
Well, that's right.
With this latest lawsuit from Alvin Bragg.
Yeah, New York is apparently becoming the center of the political universe pretty quickly here. We've got a field hearing next week that we'll talk about on violence in the city that Jim Jordan is bringing forth. And now the DA from Manhattan is suing Jim Jordan over his efforts that he says to interfere with this investigation and now indictment, Donald Trump. And
at the same time, Kevin McCarthy is going to be at the New York Stock Exchange. He clearly has a message for Wall Street,
again,
but it feels like it's going to be overshadowed.
All this has happened since we got up today.
Yeah, exactly. And joining us to discuss all of this around the table are Bloomberg's Mario Parker and Laura Davison. Laura, let's start with you. You're looking at what Congress has been doing. Does Jim Jordan, does he get this lawsuit? Is he concerned? Is something that it worries him?
Jim Jordan is not concerned about this lawsuit at all. What Jim Jordan really is good at is setting up a great political fight. That's been the case ever since he came to Congress, and that's what he does well. So, this field hearing that they're having, this is something that House Republicans have just started doing. Instead of just having these boring hearings in the boring rooms in the Capitol, they're going places. They've done several. They went to the U.S.-Mexico border. They've had others in West Virginia and Ohio, and they've had some complaints from folks saying, we're not getting media coverage. So where else better to go? To New York City. Democrats are already planning their own press conferences around this. Kevin McCarthy's going to be there that day as well. All eyes are going to be on New York, and this will certainly be, Jim Jordan's going to get what he wants. He's going to show Republicans that he's fighting back and against crime, against those that are going after Trump, and he's really, making his mark as Judiciary Chairman.
The response, by the way, from DA Bragg to Jim Jordan's field hearing that we're talking about for Manhattan next week, Mario, is clearly something he had fun writing or someone did for him. Don't be fooled, he writes. The House GOP is coming to the safest big city in America for a political stunt. He goes to talk about crime rates in New York that he says are down. Murders, shootings, burglaries, robberies. And says if you want to have a field hearing on violent crime, go to Ohio.
Yeah, well, the subtext of all of this, right, is that Jim Jordan is one of the biggest allies, the strongest allies of former President Donald Trump. And the subtext that they're trying to present, at least, is that Alvin Bragg's going after former President Donald Trump when he should be dealing with the real criminals in this unsafe New York City.
Yes, right.
And so it's that political back and forth. And it looks like Bragg is, he's not shying away from it.
Should Bragg be doing this? Does this diminish potentially the office that he's almost getting involved in this fight with the House GOP?
It's very risky, Anne-Marie, and that's a great point. It's very risky for the fact that the optics around this particular case already were that it was politically motivated, right? But at the same time, per Laura's point, and yours, Joe, as well, is Republicans, Jim Jordan, Donald Trump's biggest allies, they're playing tough. So what do you do in New York? You probably have a street fight, right?
It looks like it might be a street fight over crime rates in this case, Laura. How do you get any traction when there's a narrative that New York is a very dangerous place? Remember the day of the arraignment, Marjorie Taylor Greene was tweeting about zombies drugged out, passing out before her eyes, crime.
And she said she doesn't want to go back.
Sounded like a hellscape. Yeah, of course, she was gone in about 15 minutes. You remember, Anne-Marie, but who's going to believe Bragg versus Jim Jordan when it comes to this very important Democratic issue.
Well, and so for Democrats, they're totally just shifting the narrative away from crime, and they're saying, well, what about gun violence? You had, big mass shootings, this week in Kentucky, last week in Tennessee, and they're saying, look, Republicans, you have problems with violence in your own states that you're not dealing with. So they're really just talking past each other. Bragg, Jordan, they're both political tacticians themselves. You could make an argument that Bragg should stay above the fray, even though he's technically elected. It sort of needs to appear above this street fight that may be playing out. But that's really what it's going to be, is just both sides using this. They've got the cameras on them. Make the case you want to make.
What's interesting, though, is that how is the public actually going to respond? Because there's been a latest poll, ABC Ipsos did a poll following the arraignment, and actually Trump's numbers took a hit following that arraignment. Mario, you've covered Trump. You continue to cover Trump world. When they look at this poll, is that concerning? His favorability now is 25%. All of this post the arraignment, and it's only going to get worse.
No, absolutely. It's a myopic view that they're taking, right? Because while this may help him with the primary, it's damaging for the general election and those prospects. And that comes into play with those other challengers, and they have to figure out how to sell to GOP voters to make it beyond a popularity contest, to look beyond the primary and who can beat Joe Biden in the general election. Because as you mentioned, those numbers are pretty damaging in a general election.
Now, we talk about crime in New York. How about crime in Chicago, where the numbers are not quite so favorable for the Democratic storyline, but Democrats have chosen Chicago for the DNC. The Democratic National Committee will actually convene in Chicago. They could have chosen Atlanta, which we understand was the runner-up, Mario. I thought Georgia was the future of the Democratic Party. Who did they gain by going to Chicago?
Well, as a native Chicagoan, I may add, what you get in Chicago is the union backdrop, and we know that that's very near and dear to the president as well. And then if you look at some of the things that's happened over the last couple of weeks in the Midwest, you're seeing some of those key bricks in the consequential, the ever-important blue wall that Biden needs, right? Yeah. You've got Wisconsin with the Supreme Court justice winning, the liberal-leaning Supreme Court justice. You got Chicago, just had a mayoral race where a progressive won there as well.
I find that lately what we've seen from this president was push comes to shove in very difficult decisions, whether it's the Willow Project, whether it's, he's the one that makes the final call on this DNC.
Go union.
He goes union. He steps into the union field, and that seems to be where he wants to make sure he has the backing and push the party. What was your take on Chicago? Because everyone really thought he had to go to Atlanta.
You also look just outside of Chicago, though. You've got Milwaukee, Wisconsin just to the north. You've got Michigan. Those were big wins for Biden, stealing some of those back from Trump. So this was, while he's not technically in that state, symbolically he's there. You're going to have some of the momentum, as well as, Milwaukee's 45 minutes north of,
same
Chicago.
Market.
So it really also just puts him in a zone where he's comfortable, the Rust Belt. It's his people versus trying to deal with a state and a governor in Georgia that may be less friendly. In Chicago, he's got J.B. Pritzker, big Democratic supporter, has higher ambitions himself, also a big donor. The man's a billionaire. He's worth, $3.7 billion according to the Bloomberg Billionaires Index. So there's a lot of things.
He's the winner, isn't he? He gets that primetime slot to speak.
Did you see the response from the RNC, Ronna McDaniel, on Chicago? Quote, "We look forward to the DNC's convention where their radical agenda will be on full display for the world to see." What are Republicans, who, by the way, will be in Milwaukee, right, for their convention, going to say about this, Mario?
Oh, you're already seeing it with the Ronna McDaniel statement. You're seeing Republicans point to some of the crime issues in the city as well. But again, to Laura's point, it was a perilous decision for Biden. If he would have picked Atlanta or Georgia as well, there's some pitfalls there also politically, again, with the governor, mostly red state also as well.
Are we all meeting in Chicago?
Yeah. August.
See you there.
As long as it's not the winter, I'm happy to go.
Fair enough. Many thanks to our panel to start things off. Bloomberg's Mario Parker and Laura Davison with Smart Talk here. Coming up, Asa Hutchinson, the former governor of Arkansas and now rival of former President Trump for the Republican presidential nomination. Will be with us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Thanks for joining us. The 2024 presidential race is slowly coming together. We're We're joined now by Asa Hutchinson, the former governor of Arkansas, who's preparing to announce his own 2024 Republican presidential campaign. Governor, thanks for being here. It's great to have you back on Bloomberg. I asked you back in February on Bloomberg Radio, how do you beat Donald Trump? A lot has happened since then. What's your thought today?
Well, Joe, it's good to be with you. And my thought is it's just as challenging an environment now as before, with the indictment of the former president, with all the controversies that surround his candidacy and investigations. And so it's difficult, but it's also more important. The last thing the American people want is another contest between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And if we nominate Donald Trump as a Republican nominee, we're going to lose in November. And that's why it's important. America wants to have a problem solver, somebody who's a consistent conservative and get things done and is not creating chaos every day. So that's what I offer. That's what I believe is important for America. And we yearn for that kind of leadership.
We have a recent poll, Governor, that shows following the arraignment, the former president has taken a hit in his favorability and also how Americans think he did something wrong or did something illegal. The issue is he still has control of 30% of the base. And potentially these legal troubles will start to mount, and that will concern the base, but time may not be on your side. How do you start to infiltrate that 30%?
Well, I think you can. And first of all, time will diminish that 30%, but the remaining 70% is a pretty big chunk. And that's what we compete for, as well as trying to move over traditional Trump voters. And the fact is, nobody wants this campaign to be resolved in the courtroom. It should be resolved at the ballot box. And while I've said he should drop out for the office of the presidency, he's not going to, and that's fine. So it's going to have to be a ballot box issue, and that's where we have to get in there, work hard, campaign, and be clear that Donald Trump's leadership is not what is going to take us in the right direction as a country or as a party. And so I'm actually excited about this. The ideas that we're going to present whenever I make the formal announcement on April 26th. So stay tuned, and we'll talk about the economy, we'll talk about border security, talk about my record in Arkansas, talk about the rule of law and how that is important. And my background as a former U.S. attorney will bear on that responsibility we have.
All right, Governor, so you just mentioned, too, the economy and border security, probably closely associated with what will be your platform here. But just to follow on Anne-Marie's question, there's been a lot of sort of questions about the Republican establishment, the direction of the party right now, as we see Donald Trump battle it out with the MAGA wing and get into sort of proxy battles with the governor of Florida. Do you feel like a Republican without a home? Where does a centrist establishment Republican like yourself fall into this conversation, or do you not like to be framed that way?
Well, I like to frame myself as a consistent conservative. I've been in this battle a lot longer than Donald Trump ever has. And my record in Congress, where we balanced the budget when I was there, to governor, where we created a surplus, balanced the budget, controlled spending. So that's what I want to talk about. In terms of the Republican Party and where it goes, I think we've always had, you know, our cultural conservatives, we've had our defense conservatives, we've had our economic conservatives. The key to winning is bringing those together. And I can do that. That's an important part of the message. And we're all in the same boat together, trying to build an optimistic future for America that draws on the best of our country and doesn't appeal to our worst instincts. And I believe in the future of this country, and we've got challenges with China, we've got challenges with Russia, and we need to have somebody that can lead and that can have a strong America that understands that we keep peace through the strength that we present in this country.
Governor, there's one issue that Republicans are having difficulties with in terms of their messaging. Many say the midterms were lost on this. We just saw a seat in Wisconsin, judiciary because of this, and that is abortion. And even the RNC chairwoman says that we have a messaging problem when it comes to abortion, and potentially this is going to be a massive 2024 issue. I want to quickly get your take on what happened in Texas with the federal judge. In Washington, this is a debate on whether or not the FDA should just ignore that ruling. Do you think the FDA should? They have the authority to.
Well, generally, we give regard to court rulings, but this is in dispute. You've got two federal rulings that are in conflict. I expect that this will ultimately reach the United States Supreme Court, and they will resolve that. But in the meantime, you have each state having different rules that reflect their culture, their democracy, their legislature. Arkansas has a very pro-life position. You've got other states that do not. And so we're going to have to resolve this right now state by state, and that's the flexibility that I think our founding fathers designed for us. We also have to show compassion. We have to make sure that we have sufficient maternal health care and support for them. We have to have good adoption services. And those are important messages that we as Republicans and as Americans should have. So it's a divisive issue, but right now the answer is let's talk about the right exceptions. Which I support the exceptions for life of the mother and for the exceptions of rape and incest. And whenever you have those exceptions in place and each state being able to resolve their own issues, then it's a fight within the legislature. And I think that's where we'll be in 2024.
Former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to continuing this conversation as you gear up to formally announce your bid in just 2 weeks' time. We'll have more coming up next. This is Bloomberg.
The Biden administration set to unveil tough curbs on vehicle emissions tomorrow, the toughest ever. We talked about it with Ali Zaidi, White House climate advisor, earlier on what to expect.
The president is focused on pursuing the goals he set out before the American people. One, that means reinvigorating our manufacturing capability here in the United States. For a bunch of years, we've ceded the leadership on electric vehicles, on hydrogen vehicles to other countries. Over the last 2 years, we've worked double time to catch up on that. $100 billion of battery investment alone has been announced coming into the U.S. under the president's watch. The second goal is to make sure that we are cutting costs for consumers. The rules that we'll propose tomorrow will do that. They will meet that test by thousands of dollars for consumers over the first few years of their ownership of the vehicle. And the third is to meet the test on climate. We've set an incredibly bold goal of cutting our emissions economy-wide by 50 to 52% by 2030. This will help us do just that. So massive public health benefits, but then also huge benefits for our workers and manufacturing capability, for consumers, for energy security. This meets that test in historic fashion.
We have even Tesla coming out, though, talking about all this federal money that's going to production for electric vehicles, to the charging station of electric vehicles. At what point do you think we can actually see an EV mandate in the United States?
You know, the reality is we don't need a mandate of a particular type of fuel or vehicle. There will be a mix that propel us from point A to point B. In the commercial space, for example, hydrogen has been a fuel of choice to decarbonize. We're seeing sustainable aviation fuels, which got incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act. Those biofuels will help us decarbonize in aviation. We're seeing other hydrogen-based fuels decarbonize in the marine sector. And in vehicles, I think we're going to see a broad set of technologies take off. The core goal has to be boosting our energy security, making this stuff here in America, and reducing our emissions. We're relentlessly focused on reducing our emissions, but not going to be picking technology winners and losers.
How about picking a timetable, though? The scientific community has suggested that the auto fleet should be net zero by the year 2050 to avoid, the worst impact of climate change. How do you get there?
I think we're putting ourselves on that path. And what people have to realize is one, the auto sector is a bunch of subsectors that make up that, right? You got, now we're starting to make electric tractors, right? But there are long-haul applications where hydrogen's going to be a big deal. We need to help with the diffusion of that technology. And then in the light-duty sector, there's going to be a transformation that takes place, but we have to recognize that the scrappage on those vehicles, the amount of time before the stock turns over is usually about 10 to 15 years. So when you start backing that out, you know that you've got to be on a hockey stick transformation. And the reality is that's where the market's going. I talked about the battery investment that's come in since the president took office. That investing in America agenda means that by 2030, we'll have the capability to produce 13 million batteries worth of cars in 2030. For the last few years, we've sold about 15, 16 million vehicles a year. So we're talking about the capability to produce most of those being electric. That's a really big deal.
Your Republican critics, who we hear from on a regular basis here on Balance of Power, say the Biden administration is trying to create some sort of artificial economy for EVs, that they're too expensive, that people need to have cheaper cars that are going to run on gas for longer than the administration is willing to admit. I wonder your response to that, as they suggest that you're at odds, you're actually enemies with the oil industry. How do you answer those critics?
The Biden administration has overseen a massive and unprecedented expansion in American energy and in American manufacturing. Every metric, we are growing the technologies, the capability to make those technologies, and the deployment that we need to boost our energy security, to cut consumer costs. The reality is, yeah, we are going to need a variety of fuel sources to get to where we need to go. There are vehicles that are going to run on gasoline for decades to come because they've already been, in certain cases, purchased and going to just go. We need to meet those consumers where they are.
Doesn't that make the goals difficult to achieve, though?
I think the goals take into account reality. They take into account the techno-economics, and they take into account the incredible manufacturing renaissance that the president's unleashed. From congressional Republicans, though, let's see what they've put forward. H.R. 1, their signature piece of legislation, repeals big parts of the Inflation Reduction Act. The VP was in Dalton, Georgia, just last week, announcing the expansion of a solar manufacturing facility in a district represented by someone who not only voted against the Inflation Reduction Act, which made that solar manufacturing possible, but wants to repeal it. So, if we want to be for solutions, energy security, cutting consumer costs, boosting American manufacturing competitiveness, standing with the American worker and the American family, that's the president's Investing in America agenda.
Ali Zaidi, White House Deputy National Climate Advisor. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. The IMF, in cutting its global growth outlook today, referenced the recent banking crisis and uncertainty around financial sector stress. But Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, she sounded a bit more hopeful.
I've not really seen evidence at this stage suggesting a contraction in credit, although that is a possibility. The U.S. economy is obviously performing exceptionally well, with continued solid job creation, inflation gradually moving down, robust consumer spending. So I'm not anticipating a downturn in the economy, although, of course, that remains a risk.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen there ahead of the spring meetings for the IMF. And Bloomberg's Kayleigh Lyons was in the room with the secretary earlier and is here with more. So she's a bit more optimistic.
A bit more optimistic. Granted, she did acknowledge that risks exist, but her language definitely wasn't quite as concerned, perhaps, as we saw when the IMF released its World Economic Outlook this morning. In cutting the GDP growth forecast for this year to 2.8%, they said, quote, with the recent increase in financial market volatility, the fog around the World Economic Outlook has thickened, uncertainty is high, and the balance of risks have shifted firmly to the downside so long as the financial sector remains unsettled.
And they talked about the risk of financial conditions tightening even more. And that's something we're actually seeing evidence of when you look at credit conditions in the U.S. We just got the NFIB small business survey out this morning that showed a net 9% of them said financing was more difficult to attain than 3 months ago. That's the greatest share going back to 2012. And actually the largest share in a decade said they expect financing conditions to worsen in the next 3 months. So clearly there is some signs of credit stress, and yet Janet Yellen doesn't necessarily seem to be singing that tune.
Yeah, it's a little bit, do you want to believe me or your lying eyes, on of all of these weeks to hear such different messages. Granted, she did, to your point, point to some of the potential risks that are out there. China was another area of, I don't know, disagreement, but there's a different worldview.
Yeah, it's true. Earlier this week on Monday, the IMF released a separate report talking about the risks to the global economic outlook in a decoupled world in which it's split between U.S.-centric camps and China-centric camps. And they said in the next 5 years, that could hit global GDP by 1% and by 2% in the long term. Janet Yellen received a question in that press conference today around the idea of fragmentation and friendshoring. Here was her response.
We're mainly concerned about over-dependence on some critical areas for China and are seeking to reduce that dependence. I think the argument that friendshoring is going to cause huge fragmentation and loss of the benefits of trade is really not valid.
So not valid, guys. Maybe the IMF would beg to differ.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting week for sure. China is going to completely dominate what we've seen so far, what's coming out of the IMF. Bloomberg's Kayleigh Lyons, thank you so much. Joe, following on what Secretary Yellen had to say about China, remember, she's actually supposed to go to Beijing.
Yes,
a long list of cabinet officials that are supposed to go. Gina Raimondo says she wants to go. Blinken still hasn't gone.
And that's as opposed to Taiwan, which brings us to our next conversation.
Yes, exactly. But let's take a listen to what Janet Yellen had to say about that potential trip to Beijing.
In terms of my plans to visit China, I still hope to go. President Biden has emphasized the importance of opening up and maintaining channels of communication, and I hope to go at the appropriate time.
Hopes to go at the appropriate time. The Treasury Secretary joining us now to discuss what this all means is Bonnie Glaser, Director of the Asia Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. So, Bonnie, we do have a number of U.S. officials who are slated to go. They say they're going to go, but obviously tensions continue to brew, which make it very difficult. One of those moments happened this week. China continuing military drills after the Taiwanese president met with Speaker McCarthy. I was there last week in California. And then on the heels of all of that, Emmanuel Macron in China, and also with some interesting comments coming out of it. Can you contextualize what all of this means now, especially given the fact that Emmanuel Macron was really saying he doesn't want to choose between Washington or Beijing?
Well, there's a lot of moving pieces here to unpack. Certainly, the U.S. China relationship is one piece. And now that President Tsai Ing-wen's transit to the United States is finished, China has completed its military exercises, I think that there is the potential for a high-level contact to resume. We know that President Biden, of course, has reached out to China's leader Xi Jinping and asked for a phone call, and perhaps that might get scheduled. We also have commerce officials who are currently in Beijing talking to the Chinese about the possibility of Secretary Raimondo's visit. So there's the U.S.-China piece. Then, of course, there's Europe, and Macron was in Beijing with the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. And just before going to Beijing, von der Leyen gave a very tough speech on China and tried to forge, I think, European unity around a tougher stance toward China. And I think that French President Macron essentially undermined that position. He positioned himself in a way of saying that the relationship with Beijing is important by itself and transatlantic relations perhaps may be less important, and undermined, I think, EU unity in the process. Macron endorsed Xi Jinping's call for multipolarity and for Europe to be a separate pole from the United States and from China. This is a position that China has long held. And of course, Macron's call for strategic autonomy, he may not have intended it to mean that this would weaken the transatlantic relationship. But that's certainly what Xi Jinping wants to do. He wants to drive a wedge between the United States and Europe. So I think that this is going to undermine the Biden administration's efforts to forge a coalition of countries to send tougher signals to China on trade, on Taiwan, on technology, and a whole range of other issues.
Yeah, that strategic autonomy line didn't seem to serve the alliance terribly well, Bonnie, but Emmanuel Macron left China wanting, right? He was not convinced by China's so-called peace plan for Ukraine. So does he leave with regrets?
I don't know if he leaves with regrets, but he did not get what he wanted. He wanted a commitment from Xi Jinping to put pressure on Russian President Vladimir Putin. He wanted Xi Jinping to commit to calling Ukrainian President Zelensky on the phone, which Xi Jinping has not done since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of last year. So apparently Xi Jinping said he might be willing, but he didn't say when. And let's distinguish between a potential willingness to make that phone call and actually doing it.
You know, he gave this interview on his way out, even though he didn't get what he wanted. And what struck me about the political interview is that they actually said that they allowed them to look at the transcript, and he had even more frank comments, particularly about Taiwan, that they did not print. Does this undermine what the U.S. is trying to do with China, especially as they try to go at it multilaterally with European partners, given Macron's, not just his visit, but these interviews he gave and even frank comments that the elite said they didn't want out there?
I think it potentially does undermine the Biden administration's efforts. The administration has been working closely with the European Union in the trade talks, trying to find common approaches, including, of course, restrictions on technology. There are conversations underway about investment screening on outbound investment into China that are at an early stage. And of course, we have the Netherlands working with the Biden administration on the export controls on semiconductors. There are a lot of things that are underway. And from the Biden administration's point of view, alliances are central to our strategy. The Biden administration has said that they want to invest, that is, invest in America, align with our allies, and use those two pillars of our strategy in order to more effectively compete with China. And I think that Macron has undermined that aligned piece.
Bonnie, thank you so much for that. Bonnie Glaser of the German Marshall Fund. Interesting what Bonnie says there about not just undermining the Biden administration, but remember, the Biden administration really wants to set themselves apart from the prior administration. Indeed. They each had both have very hard policies.
Yeah, there's not a lot of sunshine between the two.
On China,
Absolutely.
But how they go about it. Biden administration really wants to make it clear we want a multilateral approach. How do you do that when Emmanuel Macron is saying...
It's strategic autonomy.
Yes.
By the way, who goes first? Is it Blinken or is it the Secretary of Treasury, Commerce? Seems like we need to deal with some negotiations here on a political level before we start talking economic partnerships, but we'll see.
100%.
Yeah. Coming up, we have a lot to go through with our political panel, clearly, including the drip, drip, drip of leaked information from the Pentagon on U.S. military intelligence. We learned a lot more today. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
Now, keeping you up to date with news from around the world, here's the first word. I'm John Hyland. A fifth person has died in the shooting at a bank in Louisville, Kentucky. The attack was blamed on a 25-year-old employee of the bank who was killed in a shootout with police. Police say the shooter was live streaming during the attack. Russia will expand the penalties for draft evaders. That's aimed at fixing the problems exposed in last year's mobilization of 300,000 reservists to fight in Ukraine. Under the new plan, draft evaders would be banned from leaving the country, getting driver's licenses, buying and selling property, and taking loans. For the first time, a woman will be in charge of the UK's cyber spying agency, GQ. Anne Keyes-Butler is currently Deputy Director General of Britain's Domestic Intelligence Service, MI5. GCHQ is the UK's listening post. It provides signals intelligence to both government and armed forces. Twitter is an independent company no more. According to a document, Twitter, quote, no longer exists after being merged with the Nevada-based company called X-Corp. It's not clear what the change means for the social media giant, and the company didn't respond to requests for comment. But owner Elon Musk previously said he wants to turn X into an everything app similar to China's WeChat. Global news, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm John Hyland. This is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg is now suing Ohio Republican Congressman Jim Jordan, pushing back against the GOP-led congressional probe of Donald Trump's hush money indictment. In a 50-page lawsuit, Bragg stating that the field investigation is, quote, a direct threat to federalism and the sovereign interests of the state of New York. This court should put an end, he writes, to this constitutionally destructive fishing expedition. Here to discuss, Lisa Camuso-Miller, partner at Reset Public Affairs and former communications director for the Republican National Committee, joined at the table by Kevin Walling, the former Biden campaign Democratic strategist. Kevin, what in the world is going on here? Now we've got the DA from Manhattan suing Jim Jordan ahead of a field hearing on New York crime on Monday. Is he compromising his view in the public as people accuse him of being all politics?
Well, I think he's interested in taking the fight to Republicans on this issue, and all eyes will be on New York at that field hearing on Monday. Some Democrats have already indicated that they will actually participate in that hearing as part of that committee process. But certainly, I think you're wanting to see an Alvin Bragg, who's elected by the people, right? He's responsible to the people and his base party politics, taking the fight back to these Republicans and being a little bit more forceful in the pushback.
Alvin Bragg talking about destructive fishing expedition. He says these Republicans are coming to his state. Republicans are always about state rights. Does he have a point here? Will this resonate with Republican voters, Lisa?
Well, you know, it's hard to say. I mean, we're obviously on uncharted territory, right? I mean, there's no way to know what any of this is, what impact it's going to have. But the one thing I would say is that Bragg has definitely stoke the fire here, right? He has shown that this is going to be a back and forth between the Republicans and Democrats, and how this is definitely going to be something that we're going to have to just live through, unfortunately. I think the Republicans are ready for it. I think they're ready for that's the stance that they've taken for the full year, and Jim Jordan's probably happy to have the argument.
The reaction we saw from Alvin Bragg, separate from this lawsuit, to Jim Jordan announcing the field hearing, his reaction on Twitter was remarkable. He writes, "Don't be fooled. House GOP is coming to the safest city in America for a political stunt." He includes crime stats and says, if you want to have a real field hearing on violence, meet me in Ohio, where Jim Jordan, of course, is from. How does Jim Jordan respond to clear data? Murders down 14%, shootings down 17%. I could keep going.
I think that any of your audience that's in New York would probably challenge some of that, because New York is definitely a place where we're having that debate in every big city across the country. This is an economic debate. I mean, when the economy is struggling, when people are out of work, crime goes up. And that's exactly what's happening. It's this tactic that the Republicans used in the midterm elections as a talking point, and one that they were successful in. I think they're going to continue to use it, and I think that's why Jim Jordan's going to New York.
Well, this was a huge issue in the midterm elections. It was, do you feel safe, especially coming after COVID? And actually, crime and education resonates with a lot of independents and suburban voters.
It does, certainly, especially those folks with kids. And Lisa and I are actually in agreement. Perception is everything. I think Democrats lose ourselves in talking about statistics, right? When you don't feel safe in your community, when you go and try and buy shampoo and it's behind locked glass, as it is at the Target in Cleveland Park where I live, perception is everything, right? Even if those statistics tell a different story. And New York is far safer than it was 10 years ago, even 20 years ago in the 90s. Yeah. But again, perception is everything.
There's another big story that we're following today that Alvin Bragg is probably keeping an eye on, and that's the group of 8 looking at some of the documents that were found at Mar-a-Lago, the classified documents that being investigated by the special counsel here. It reminds us that we have multiple cases going here, and this issue with Alvin Bragg is only one of them.
That's really true. And, of course, the former president is facing 4 different lawsuits as part of this investigation. Those are part of the special counsel's investigation. But this is actually a rare part of bipartisanship that we're seeing with Marco Rubio and Mark Warner, the leaders of the Senate Intelligence Committee. They have been demanding, and you've been covering this, for months, that they get some kind of look at what these documents entail from those 3 individuals, Biden, Pence, and Donald Trump. That's a victory for intelligence, the Intelligence Committee, and bipartisanship.
One victory for the Intelligence Committee. We're going to talk about another one in a little bit. Coming up, we have more of it. Lisa and Kevin, they're back with us. We're also going to be discussing the selection of Chicago as the 2024 DNC convention site. It was also a little bit controversial. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Democrats announcing plans to hold their 2024 national convention in Chicago on the heels of key victories in the city and in the larger Midwest. Back with us again are Lisa Camusa-Miller and Kevin Walling. Kevin, Chicago, you say, is a win, but many people are disappointed. They wanted Atlanta.
A lot of folks wanted Atlanta. I think this is a win for holding that blue wall in place, right? That was what powered Donald Trump's victory, was Michigan and Wisconsin. He narrowly lost Minnesota. We hold those states back. There's no way a Republican win the Electoral College. I think this makes sense, not just from an electoral perspective, but also just a logistic perspective. When you look at hotel rooms, you've got Milwaukee, as you just said, in the other segment, 45 minutes away. So you have this logistical organization behind this win for Democrats hosting it in
and a Democratic
City.
Governor, of course.
Democratic governor, Democratic legislature, Democratic mayor. We're not fighting with Brian Kemp in Georgia. I think it's a slam dunk.
You talk about holding the blue wall. How about building the blue wall? We were told that Georgia was the future of the Democratic Party. Stacey Abrams built the machine. If it weren't for Senators Ossoff and Warnock, that would not be a Democratic majority. Yeah. Guess they'll get an invite to Chicago?
They'll get an invite. They'll be right up front, I hope. You can't win everybody over, Joe. Okay. But, Georgia's also the future, and the South is also the future of the Democratic Party.
Lisa, I know not your party, but does this just signal that the Biden administration, Joe Biden in particular, always wants to lean into the unions when push comes to shove?
Yeah, I mean, it feels that way. And it also feels like this is where we're going to take the fight, right? The fight for the votes are going to be in the Midwest, right? The Republicans are going to be in Milwaukee. Now we know that the Democrats are going to be in Chicago. This is the fight for where the common ground is. And these are the votes that everyone needs in order to be successful in 24. But I'm not necessarily sure that the location of the convention translates into success in the ballot.
No, because it's all online.
Well, this is true, but does it translate into messaging that helps either side? I mean, Georgia would have been positive messaging, arguably. The RNC, your former place of business, thinks that this is good messaging for the Republican Party. Ronna McDaniel says, we look forward to the DNC convention, where their radical agenda will be on full display for the world to see. Voters will soundly reject out-of-touch liberals and so on. They're going to make this the crime story that Jim Jordan wants to tell in New York next week.
That's absolutely true. I mean, we've already seen the playbook. We've seen how it played out in the midterms. They're going to use it again. And that sounds like, to me, that's exactly the way the chairwoman is headed. But I also think that there's a lot of ground to cover. And I don't think that Georgia ever really was a battleground. I've been inside the building when the decision gets made. It strikes me that maybe the noise could have been too great because of all of the Trump nonsense that's going on in Georgia also,
Fulton County. Fascinating.
Kevin, just quickly wrapping up, I cannot have you in the studio not ask about Joe Biden landing. He's going to the UK, and he's going
to UK first, Northern
Ireland, and then he's going to Dublin. He's giving a tour. He's going on a tour of his family history, but also potentially there's going to be some policy work.
We'll see if there is. I think this is a homecoming for the president. He's going to County Mayo, where my ancestors are from. It's where the Finnegans are from. I know. I tried to get on Air Force One. There's, as you two know, there's only so many seats. But it's going to be a great visit. And obviously it's in recognition of 25 years of the Good Friday Agreement, which is in some level of question with Brexit and obviously the politics in Northern Ireland.
But, Joe, obviously a little bit of an awkward moment, of course, because the president has to deal with these leaked documents that American allies are not happy about.
The Pentagon documents. We'll have more on that, I'm sure, as this week unfolds. Great conversation, and many thanks to our panel. Lisa Camusa-Miller, Kevin Walling with us on Balance of Power. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and online.
Thanks for joining us this evening on Balance of Power. Coming up tomorrow, we'll speak with former CIA Director Leon Panetta. This is Bloomberg. Stay with us. We'll see you tomorrow.